Hello my friends, and welcome back to another video. Today is going to be my favorite horror books of 2023. Now, just a disclaimer, I only have 6 books to talk about. This was not a good year for horror for me. I did not enjoy most of the horror books I read, and if I did enjoy them, it was more like a 4-star feeling than it was a 5-star feeling. So this list was actually very hard for me to do because I just didn't have that many horror books that stood out to me or made me feel a certain type of way, and it was just not a good year for horror and not a good reading year in general for me. There were just not that many standout books and it was pretty disappointing. So this is gonna be probably on the shorter side because I only have 6 books to talk about, but these are my absolute favorite books from 2023. I gave all of them 5 stars except for one I gave 4.5, but they're all like my favorites. They all made me feel a certain type of way when I read them. I had such strong and visceral reactions to these books, and that's why they're included in this. I wanted these to be the best of the best in terms of horror for me and not just books that I liked but I didn't absolutely love. Unfortunately, I only have 6 books to talk about for 2023 in terms of horror. Again, horror and I just did not get along this year. It was very disappointing for me because horror is my favorite genre of books to read. But here's hoping that 2024 will be the year of horror. I hope, because I really don't want to have a best of list like this one again. I want more books on it. I usually have at least 10, but it is what it is. So, without further ado, let's get into the 6 best horror books I read in 2023. So first up is Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. I absolutely fell head over heels in love with this book. It just had me in a trance from the moment I started it. It has the most beautiful writing. This author is extremely talented and I cannot wait to read more from them because their writing just sucked me in. I could absolutely feel the environment that I was reading about. I could feel the weather. I could just see it playing behind my eyes like a movie, and that is so incredibly exciting to me when I find a book that can make me feel that way when I'm reading it. So from the moment I started this book, I was hooked, but it just had all the makings for me personally to love it. It had all the tropes that I love, and this is actually more of a slow burn horror, which is typically not my favorite kind. I find it to be usually way too slow. I'm much more of a fast-paced horror type of person. I like action, I like excitement, and I like it to get to the point quick. So for me to absolutely love a book that is this slow is really saying something about the writing, because the writing has to be on point for me to feel that way, and Jessica Johns definitely had their writing on point for this book. But this story is about the main character, Mackenzie, who is having very intense dreams, and they all revolve around her sister who died. And Mackenzie is dealing with a lot of grief and a lot of guilt surrounding her sister's death, and she's just not really dealing with it at all, but these dreams are getting more and more intense to the point where she's waking up with a severed crow's head in her hands. She's also being followed by crows, and she decides that she cannot do this alone. She cannot handle what she is experiencing, so she ends up going back home, but she actually left home because of her grief and her guilt surrounding her sister's death, but she knows she needs her family to help her get through whatever she is experiencing. This is a very sad story. Of course, like I said, it is dealing with grief, and Mackenzie's guilt is so heavy and so prominent that I felt like I could relate and feel that grief. It's just laced throughout these pages. You can really just feel how Mackenzie's feeling every time she even mentions her sister, and it's just such like a sad book, but in a way that I love because it also has a hopeful note surrounding it, which I also really love. I love my bleak and depressing books, but I also love a note of hopefulness. I just think it's very beautiful. So this is a supernatural horror story, and it does have a trope that I absolutely love inside of it as well, which I think also pushed me towards absolutely loving this book. But everything from the beginning to the end, I just devoured. I thought this was incredibly beautiful, And again, the writing was just so luscious. I could literally picture and feel the cold weather. When they were talking about snow, I could feel the air change. It was just so exciting to read a book like that and have those feelings. And that's why this book made it onto my top books of 2023, because it was just so incredibly beautiful. I highly recommend checking this out if you're looking for a horror book that is written by an Indigenous author. If you love supernatural elements and you love grief stories and you like slow burns, I think you would really enjoy this. And it's a very quick read. It doesn't feel as long as it could feel, even though it is a slow burn. And I did give this 5 stars. Next up is House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. I know this was on a lot of people's favorites list in 2022, but I actually didn't read it until the beginning of this year, and I'm so mad at myself because this book was just absolute perfection. I love Alexis Henderson's writing. I enjoyed Year of the Witching so much as well, but this one was just perfection in terms of atmosphere. If you love gothic atmosphere, I think you would really, really enjoy this story. This is about the main character, Marion, who is living in extreme poverty, and she ends up getting a job as a blood maid for the rich and wealthy. And I did not know what to expect going into this one. I wasn't sure what kind of story we were getting. I knew it was like on the cusp of being a vampire-esque story, and it is. I think it's just a very different take on vampires. It's not what I think people expect when they hear the word vampire. It's not what's going to come to mind when they picture a vampire story, but I think that's why I enjoyed it so much, because it was so different. This year I really branched out and have tried to read more vampire stories, and I found that I really enjoy vampire horror, even though I previously thought I didn't. But this book in particular, I think, just really made me want to read more, because this is like what I want from all gothic vampire-esque stories. I just thought it was so well done, and the writing is beautiful, the atmosphere is beautiful. I loved every second of it. I loved how this book ends. I would love Alexis Henderson to make more in this kind of world. I would love to just see it expanded upon. I think there are so many stories that could come from this world, and I would read every single one of them. I would be lining up, here's my money, take it, I want it, please give it to me. And I just really hope that Alexis Henderson is planning on coming back to this world and maybe exploring it a bit more in other books. I just think that would be so incredible, and I'm anticipating it, hopefully. I hope I'm not getting my hopes up just to be crushed, but I think it would be awesome, and this book was just everything I wanted it to be and more, and of course I gave it 5 stars. The next one really surprised me. I did not expect to even like this one. I thought I might enjoy it to some extent, but to have it be in my top books of 2023 is kind of crazy, because I just had no real expectations from it, and that is Battle Royale by Koshin Takumi. And this was part of my Patreon book club. It was so incredible. I don't think I'd had such a reaction to a book like this in such a long time. I haven't felt excited to pick up a book like this and just wanting to read, craving to read. My eyes were glued to these pages. My attention could not be swayed. I was so invested in the story. My anxiety was racing. I was literally like sitting up. I wasn't laying down. I was like, oh my god, what's gonna happen? I was just so invested in everything happening in this story. But this is about a group of 42 junior high school students in Japan who are forced to kill one another and have one sole survivor left standing. This is basically like the horror version of the Hunger Games, and I love the Hunger Games. It is one of my favorite series till this day. I loved it when I was in high school. I still love it. I reread it this year. It was still incredible, still held up to 2023 standards, and I loved it so much. So when I saw that this was compared to like the Hunger Games, and they're very similar, they have a lot in common, and I was very, very nervous because of how much I love the Hunger Games. And while they are very similar, they are also very different in my opinion, and I think I can love them both equally and love them for very different reasons. And enjoy them for very different reasons as well. This is very gruesome, it's very bloody, they have guns, there's a lot of death. Obviously there's 42 students and they're trying to only have one survivor. That's a lot of kills. So it's very, very heavy because you can't get attached to too many characters because you know, a lot of people are dying and they die very quickly. You don't get to learn too much about a lot of them. Some of them you do get to learn about, but a lot of them you get just brief glimpses of and then they're gone and it's devastating, but it's also like just such a roller coaster of emotions. And this is a chunky book. Like, this is huge. I don't do chunky books. I don't do big books. I don't like big books. And this did not feel like it was over 600 pages. Maybe because I was just so invested in it and I was so excited to finish it that I wasn't paying attention to the length, but this just flew by. It was so quick and so easy to get through. There are obviously a lot of characters. There are 42 students, so it is a little hard to keep track of who's who sometimes, but I do think it gets easier and you get a feel for the writing style and, you know, how certain characters communicate and talk and act. I think it just gets easier and easier, so I did enjoy everything about this. The ending was devastating, honestly. I was destroyed at the end of this. I literally cried. I was so upset, but I was still so invested in this book, more than I was invested in any other book probably this year. I think this one really made me love reading, and I just want more books to make me feel how I felt about this one, because this was such an incredible reading experience for me and I just enjoyed every second of it, and I did also give this 5 stars. Next up is a longtime favorite author of mine and a YA horror book. This is Where He Can't Find You by Darcy Coates. Are we surprised to see a Darcy in my favorites list? I feel like most of you won't be, because I love Darcy Coates more than any other author and I enjoy every book she writes, but specifically this book really, really, really surprised me. I always have high expectations going into a Darcy book, but I think when it's YA horror, I just always tend to lower my expectations. Not because I don't love YA horror, I do love it. It's just, I always think I overestimate how much I'm gonna get from a YA horror, and I think I just expect a lot from YA horror, because there are some YA horror books that I've read that absolutely push boundaries and go places that I just would love to see more go. So I think my expectations were lowered just slightly because I was hesitant that this wasn't going to live up to what I wanted it to be, but thank goodness this was incredible and I absolutely loved this story. This is about this town called Doubtful, and they have a missing persons problem. People go missing and they're missing for a really long time, but then they kind of just pop up, but their bodies have been cut up and re-stitched, but in very grotesque ways with this red thread, and it's the work of this person called the Stitcher. And the story is about Abby, whose sister ends up going missing, and her friends have to go find her sister because she knows that the police won't do anything since this is a very common occurrence and they just feel like they have no other options but to do it themselves. So I just got done talking about how a lot of YA horror doesn't push boundaries, but Darcy did it. Darcy did exactly what I was hoping she would do, and this is exactly what I want from YA horror. This was scary, it was creepy, it was gruesome, it was just covered in body horror, and the imagery and the descriptions were so good. They were just so well done, and I was just so happy that Darcy took this story to the level that she did. I was a little hesitant, I was a little worried. I didn't quite know what kind of story we were gonna get from this. I couldn't tell based off the synopsis if it was gonna be supernatural or not, and I'm glad that it kind of keeps you in the dark a lot of times. I'm glad that you can't really figure out a lot of what's going on and it feels kind of confusing, but in a good way. I'm glad it keeps you on your toes because I feel like that adds to the surprise and the atmosphere and the tension, and it was more enjoyable that way. I know some people have said this is kind of long for a YA horror, but honestly, I didn't feel like it was long. It felt really fast and quick to me. I felt like I devoured it in no time. This also actually scared me, which is kind of amazing and unheard of because I very, very, very rarely get scared from horror books nowadays, especially YA horror, and I was actually freaked out while reading this. Those descriptions are a lot, and I was so happy. I know that sounds silly, but I was so happy to be scared. So I just thought this was incredible. I liked how the ending kind of felt like Darcy's take on It by Stephen King, because I do love the story of It, but I'm not a big fan of Stephen King, as I feel like most of you know. So I thought this was a fun kind of nod to a classic, but also in her own spin, and I just really loved everything about this book. I loved how it ended. I loved the characters. I loved just everything. It was amazing, and I'm so glad that Darcy really did what I was hoping she was going to do with this YA horror. I also gave this 5 stars, obviously. So the only 4.5 star rating that I have in this list is Night's Edge by Liz Curran. And honestly, I was pretty shocked by this book, and that's why it's on this list. I didn't expect to love it. I thought it would be good. I thought it sounded good. I'd seen a lot of people talking about it, but a lot of hype around horror books sometimes puts me off because I just get nervous that I'm going to absolutely hate it compared to everyone else. So I get very, very nervous, and I was very nervous that this one wasn't going to live up to the hype that I had been hearing. But thankfully, this one really, really surprised me. It's not at all what I expected it to be, but kind of in the best ways possible. But this is about the main character, Mia, whose mother, Izzy, has this insatiable thirst, and it can only be satisfied by blood. And Mia's basically had to grow up extremely fast to take care of her mother. And now that Mia's in her 20s, she's just kind of living every day the same way, making sure her mom's taken care of, making sure that she gets the blood she needs, and just kind of existing, but not really living her own life because she feels like she can't. But Mia actually meets this woman named Jade, who is a musician. As they start growing closer, Mia starts wondering if maybe she can actually have a life of her own. So I was really interested in this one because I knew it was going to be a vampire horror story, and like I said earlier in this video, I have been really interested in more vampire horror, and I feel like this year I've actually read more than I ever have. So I was very interested to see what kind of vampire horror story this was going to be, and it does have vampire elements, and that is a big part of the plot, but I think an even bigger part of the plot, and really why I love this story, was the complicated mother-daughter relationship between Mia and Izzy. I just found it to be interesting, and I really loved the way it was written. I really liked the way it worked with the plot. I thought that the vampire aspect and the relationship aspect worked really well together. They weren't competing, they weren't conflicting with each other, they just worked together so harmoniously, and I really, really enjoyed that. I also really liked that this type of vampire story was more about like a vampiric disease, and I thought that was a very interesting take on it. It kind of reminded me of This Delicious Death by Kayla Cottingham, which is a YA horror about cannibalism, but I felt like they were a little bit similar because they both took very, very common horror subjects, cannibalism and vampires, but they kind of had a different spin on them that made them feel very different and unique, and I really, really enjoyed that a lot. I liked the literary style of writing. That usually doesn't work for me in horror because I feel like it can come off too smart and get confusing, and I don't know what anyone's talking about, and then I feel really dumb. But I felt like in this it was really simple but still very beautiful in terms of writing, and I felt like this book went by so quickly. I was just zooming through it. I was just done in so little time, and I loved every second of it. The only thing I didn't love about this book was the ending. I wasn't happy about the way this book ended. I just felt like it was kind of disappointing because the rest of the book was so perfect, and the ending kind of fell apart for me a little bit. I know there is going to be a sequel to this, which I am very interested in. I don't know how it's going to work. I hope I enjoy it as much as I enjoyed this one. I don't know if I will, but I will be checking out the sequel because I'm really interested in how this is gonna go. But this did get 4.5 stars for me, and I think it deserves a spot on this list because it just was such a fun but also beautiful read, and I feel like it excited me more than a lot of other horror books did this year. And last but certainly not least is a manga, and that is because this manga was absolutely wonderful. I fell head over heels in love with it, and I just thought it was incredible. So of course it had to make it on this list, and I think it tops a lot of other horror books I read this year. Even though it is a manga, I don't really care. I think it still deserves a top spot, and that is PTSD Radio. I'm just holding up volume 1, but I do rate manga by the series, not by the volume. So I have read all 3 volumes of PTSD Radio, and I did give them all 5 stars. Even though the 3rd volume was my least favorite, I think the series as a whole deserves 5 stars, so that is how I rate them. And specifically this volume, I did not know what to expect when I went into this one. I didn't know what kind of story I was gonna get. I hadn't heard much about it, but I just thought the cover looked really freaky, and I'm always in the market for a new horror manga, so I was very excited to check this one out. The artwork of this is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly stunning. It is so grotesque and so beautiful at the same time. It reminds me kind of Junji Ito in that sense. I feel like Junji Ito's art is so beautiful, but it's also so disturbing, and I feel like this one is the exact same. I just was so in love the minute I started it. It has kind of a Grudge feel to it, but it also kind of reminded me of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I don't know why, but those are the vibes I got when I was reading it. A lot of stories in here have to do with hair. This is kind of a short story collection, but I would say the short stories actually interconnect. So it kind of has like little stories that make up a bigger story, basically. That's what I would say. And a lot of the stories, there's just a lot of hair involved, and they're very creepy, and a lot of them are very quick and fast. They don't have much to them, but it's just the artwork that really gets under your skin, but like in the best way possible. It's just so eerie, and it was just so unnerving. I felt like every time I was reading it, I was so excited and I was so obsessed, but I was also like, ooh, I feel like someone's watching me, or I'm gonna look out the window and there's gonna be a face like staring right back at me. It was just, I don't know, it unnerved me, but in like the best way, and I just loved the feeling I got when I read this volume, especially this volume, but all the volumes, and I just thought it was incredible. I feel like more people need to talk about this series because it is so good, and I feel like even if you don't love the stories, I feel like you would just love the artwork because the artwork is so fun to look at. That's why I had to include it. I just loved this so much, and it was just such a fun, easy read. It didn't take too much brain power. It actually made me enjoy reading, and that's why I think it just belongs in my top horror of 2023. And there you have it, my friends. Those are my favorite horror books of 2023. Unfortunately, the list is short. I didn't have much luck with horror this year. I'm very sad about it, but I think these books really knocked it out of the park, and I think they were so well done and so amazing that I'm not even that upset that there aren't more, because these ones were so good that it kind of made up for it, I guess. I hope you enjoyed me talking about my favorite horror books of the year. Feel free to let me know what yours were in the comments down below. I would love to know, that way I can add them to my TBR if I haven't read them already. If you enjoy this type of content and you like these types of videos, let me know by giving me a thumbs up. That way I can do them for you all in the future. If you haven't already, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I also have a Patreon linked down in my description box. We can become friends, talk about books, horrifying books, thrilling books, romance books, manga, all that good fun stuff. And with that being said, I hope you are having a great day, night, morning, afternoon, wherever you are, and a happy new year. And I will see you all in my next video. Bye.